Fund and the Palestine Center. And I'd like to welcome you today. This is a August crowd to our annual meeting. This is our formal meeting for the year. We have a lot of symposiums and seminars, etc. But every year, this is the formal meeting where we have several panels that usually deal with what's current and hot in the Middle East and so on. And God knows that that is an area that always has issues. Our board of directors, most of them are here, and I'd like to welcome them and thank them for their contribution to the Palestine Center and the fund. But the people who do the work actually are the staff, and in this case also our 4 interns, and I would like very much to thank them for their efforts. I'd like first housekeeping to ask everybody to turn off their, you know, those things that make noise, music, a lot of things. Please put them on silence or vibration. Our program today consists of 4 panels. It's a very vibrant program, 2 in the morning before lunch and 2 in the afternoon. The moderators are mainly from our Palestine Center Committee, very active, and I thank them for their contributions during the year and today. They will be posing questions to the panelists and engaging them in answers and discussion among the panelists. So it's totally different format than we usually have, where we have a presentation by the panelists and then questions. This is going to be an experiment in this type of presentation. And then, of course, there will be a question and answers by the audience at the very end of each panel. I'm not going to take the time this morning and use it. Actually, in order to stay on time, to introduce the first panel, but rather I'll leave that to the moderator, who is our Jerusalem Trent Treasurer and member of the Palestine Center Committee, a plastic surgeon from Wichita Falls, Texas, Dr. Eid Mustafa. Dr. Mustafa, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Abu Khalid, for the introduction. I'm very happy to see all of you here for this annual conference. Our panel today follows a conversation format, as Dr. Ali mentioned. I will be asking some questions, and we'll leave time for questions and answers. The panelists are allowed to or encouraged to respond to each other. This will be basically the Palestine Center version of Crossfire with audience participation later on. For our online viewing audience, we encourage you to participate in the question and answer session as well by sending in your questions via Twitter. You can do so by sending them to @Palestine Center, and we will do our best to get a response from our panelists. For 2 decades, since Oslo Accords were signed, Israelis and Palestinians have engaged in on-again, off-again peace talks, moderated by the United States. During this time, we have only seen a deepening of the occupation, more than tripling of the number of settlers, and continued human rights violations. The most recent version of this process was reignited by Secretary Kerry earlier this year. This week, after several announcements of settlement expansion by Israel, the PLO negotiating team resigned. This is the state of the peace process as we convene this panel today. Our first panel is titled Prospect for Palestinian Freedom, Assessing the Peace Process and Exploring Alternatives. For this, we have 2 very distinguished panelists. The first one on my far right is Professor William Quandt. He's the Edward Stettinius Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and chair of the Department of Politics. Prior to this appointment, he was senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution, where he conducted research in the Middle East, American policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict, and energy policy. Dr. Quandt served as a staff member on the National Security Council from 72 to 74, 77 to 79, and was actively involved in the negotiations that led to the Camp David Accord and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. His selected bibliography includes Peace Process, American Diplomacy, and the Arab-Israeli Conflicts in '67, Between Ballots and Bullets, Algeria's Transition from Authoritarianism, and the United States and Egypt, an essay on policy for the 1990, among many others. The second panelist, on my immediate right, is Ali Abu Nimah, journalist and co-founder of the Electronic Intifada. He's the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. He's also a policy advisor with Al-Shabaka and contributes regularly to such publications as the Chicago Tribune and Los Angeles Times. He has served as the vice president on the board of the directors of the Arab American Action Network, was a fellow at the Palestine Center here, and has appeared in many television discussion programs with CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and others. He is involved in a number of documentaries about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Please help me welcome our two distinguished panelists. The first question I'd like to pose to our panelists is this. The peace process has not been very fruitful. It didn't show many successes. Why, in your opinion, is that the case? And I would like Professor Quandt to start.
Well, we have the whole day to answer this question, right?
You
know, there's a bumper sticker answer which can put blame on Israeli intransigence, Palestinian errors in the negotiating process, Arab disunity, American fecklessness, and all of those have some truth to them. And I think a serious answer has to try to put all of those pieces into focus. But I would say if you want a way of thinking about what went wrong after Oslo, there were imperfections, of course, in the Oslo Accords themselves. They left the destination of the so-called peace process unclear, and I think that was a recognition of the impossibility of bridging the remaining differences at that point. So they accepted a formula which in and of itself made it extremely difficult to take any next steps because there wasn't a common destination. And then secondly, built into this conflict is an imbalance of power, which makes it extraordinarily difficult for a normal negotiating model to work. Israel is in occupation, the Palestinians are under occupation. By any measure, except perhaps demography, the balance of power is in Israel's favor. And so unless you have some kind of a negotiating process that can make this a more equally balanced situation, it's very hard to imagine a normal negotiation working. Normal negotiations work when each side has things to trade and each side has things to gain, and there's a certain underlying equity in the balance of power. Without that, one side, powerful side, is tempted to dictate terms, and the other side is bound to go into a defensive mode of saying, you know, we have to protect our limited equities by not making concessions. And that's why this conflict hasn't worked as a face-to-face negotiation. It's very nice to say, let's get the parties together and let them talk, and they ought to be able to settle their differences, but it doesn't work that way. And it's not just a matter of lack of goodwill, it is structural. So that's why I have always thought that if this was ever going to be resolved through negotiations, and it may not be possible to, there has to be a very strong third party who's willing to do some of the heavy lifting of putting together the compromise proposals and putting some of its own assets into the negotiations in terms of incentives. If you cooperate, this is the payoff. If you don't cooperate, here's what you risk. And there's really, in my view, only one party who has both the incentive and the power to do it, and it wasn't the Norwegians. That's why Oslo turned out the way it did. Norwegians were full of goodwill. They did what they could, but at the end of the day, they didn't have any real power. So the United States does. The question is, it doesn't use it, and I think we know some of the reasons for that. But that's my initial answer to your question.
Ali?
Thank you. Just first to say I'm happy to be back here and to see everyone here again. It's always a pleasure to be at the Palestine Center. I mean, I think I want to disagree with the premise of the question a little bit, very respectfully. I think depending on whose perspective you look from, the peace process has been an incredible success, really one of the most successful endeavors in diplomatic history. If you we cast our minds back to 1991 when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, or in that period, I forget the exact date, Yitzhak Shamir said, after he left power in '92, that for him the peace process was to talk and talk and talk, and in the meantime Israel would continue to confiscate land and build settlements. He said for 10 years, and that they would, fill up the West Bank. Actually, it far exceeded his expectations because they've been able to do that for 20 years without interruption. So it's been very successful from the perspective of Israel in stealing land, and stealing land with not just stealing land, but with subsidy and financing from the United States and the European Union. So not only did Israel manage to continue its occupation, colonization, but through the so-called peace process, it managed to secure open-ended international financing for this project. So a great success. From the perspective of the United States, it's been very successful in recent years as a tranquilizer for the region. Whenever you want to have a war in Iraq or a war here or a war there, you raise the hopes of the Arabs and people and say, well, we're going to have a peace process, we're going to be very serious, just you wait and see. And we've seen this story repeated time and again. Now the phase we're in is one where, it's simply a game everyone plays. I feel my microphone is too loud. Am I echo? Okay, it's okay. All right. That it's a game everyone plays, but I don't think there's a serious person on the planet who thinks that there's going to be an agreement and a two-state solution, all of that. But everyone has to continue playing the game. John Kerry and Obama and Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu, and now the most enthusiastic supporters of negotiations are the Israelis, because they went from land for peace to land or peace, and now to land and peace. We just keep building and taking land. And
Right.
So a great success.
Success for one part. Professor Quandt, you mentioned that the U.S. is the party that can make a difference. They are the one running the negotiations, or the main party. What other players can there be, because what's happening right now is not working?
Well, theoretically, there's people talk about, let's put this back in the hands of the UN Security Council, United Nations. But of course, the United Nations is just a body made up of states, and one of those states actually is the United States. And I think, if you want to think about initiatives that have broad international support, the United Nations could play some kind of a role, but I don't think one should get too excited about the prospects. It's odd that people talk about the return of Russia to a role in the Middle East with its role in Syria and with Iran. And interestingly, Netanyahu is going to Moscow in a week or so. And the Egyptians have just had. So I'd be delighted to see the Russians make some serious contribution. I can't imagine what it would really be. So I don't really think there is another external party that can magically step in and make something happen in the situation that exists now. If there were a change of dynamics and Israelis, for whatever reasons, came to their senses and realized they needed an agreement with the Palestinians instead of, as Ali described, a seeing the peace process as a cover for continued occupation and confiscation of land and so forth. If they came to their senses and said, we actually need an agreement, then I think an agreement would find a lot of willing supporters in the international community. Europeans, people talk about the emerging role of China. Well, China does virtually nothing, but they've got money. They could contribute to, development funds. They could be investors. There are a lot of countries who could step in once the basic deal, if there is a deal to be had, whether it's Ali's preferred one state or other people's two-state outcomes. There are a lot of people in the international community who could help make that work just by doing normal, decent things. Development aid, compensation for people's lost properties, investment, things like that. But the hard work of diplomacy to get the parties to reach an agreement is either going to have to be done by the parties themselves or with some external help, largely from the United States.
Ali, do you care to comment?
Yeah, I would say that I think that help from the United States is not going to come, and we should stop waiting for it. And the help that has been coming from the United States is, again, to keep it very basic, helping Israel to steal the land. And that dynamic is not going to change. And the United States cannot be both a participant and combatant, which it is. It's combating on the side of Israel to help Israel to steal Palestinian land, and an honest broker for peace. So I think we should have a proper understanding of the American role as a combatant that arms and finances one side, assures that what the Americans say openly, the Israeli qualitative advantage and superiority over everyone in the region, and it's that superiority that allows Israel to steal the land with impunity. So the Americans are participants. Some people have said, well, the Europeans. I mean, you can wait for the Europeans for another 100 years. The Europeans have been wringing their hands for decades. Finally, they came up with these very minor guidelines on financing projects and settlements, where they said we won't fund Israeli institutions that work in the settlements in the West Bank. And it was called a diplomatic earthquake. I mean, in fact, it was a very minor step, and the Europeans are busy retreating from it and backtracking from it and trying to find a way to appease the Israelis so the Israelis can continue to steal land and receive European financing. I think what has changed in the past few years, and what needs to continue to change, is that we have to start to think outside the confines of a purely diplomatic paradigm in which we're waiting for men and increasingly women in suits to come and be our saviors and put pressure here and put pressure there. And what has grown in the past few years is I think the real peace process, for example, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has become a real factor. Let's remember that in his last speech to AIPAC last year, President Obama, or last spring, President Obama in his first opening moments denounced the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So when the President of the United States feels the need to denounce this movement and pledge to put all his formidable political and diplomatic power to stop this movement, as he did in front of AIPAC, that should be a clue to us that this is actually a factor that can make a difference, and we should encourage and support it.
Well said. So it's been 20 years in the peace process. Let's assume that the world as a whole comes to the realization that the current peace process is not going anywhere. What alternatives are there? Ali, you might want to address that. What alternatives are there for the world community to resolve this issue and for the parties involved?
I don't want to say, I mentioned already boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think that's a very good framework. I don't want to say it's the beginning and the end or the only set of options, but it's a very good framework to begin with. Boycott and divestment are civil society movements which are growing on campuses and churches, and as I said, becoming a real factor. And the proof of that is the amount of resource the Israeli government is putting into combating boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Just in June, Netanyahu placed a responsibility for combating the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in the Prime Minister's office and in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and they're allocating large sums of money to this. So that's one element. The next step of that is sanctions, which means state-level action to end Israeli impunity. And we've started to see, I think, the beginning of that. Now, I mentioned the European Union guidelines, even though they're very weak and very mild. At the time that they were announced in July, some European diplomats said in the media, they said, well, in fact, you know, these guidelines were a result of, in part, a response to public pressure within Europe. You have to remember that unlike the United States, in the United States, the public is largely supportive of Israel. That's starting to change, but it's largely supportive of Israel, as are the political elites. So the political elites and the public, broadly speaking, are in line in the United States. In Europe, that's not the case. The political elites are completely beholden to Israel in the United States, but the public is very strongly supportive of Palestinian rights.
In Europe.
In Europe. So that pressure is starting to filter up, and we see that in the EU guidelines, weak as they are in movements to label settlement goods. We should be aiming for a total ban on settlement goods, of course. And we're seeing other forms of state-level action, for example, in several countries, state pension funds or sovereign wealth funds, that kind of thing, divesting from companies that are involved in Israel's occupation, profiteering industries and war crimes industries. For example, Norway's state pension funds, New Zealand's state pension funds. So these are the beginnings of a movement that should again be encouraged and pressed. And you know, when you're dealing with such a huge power imbalance, and if we say, well, we want nonviolence and we're against violence, then you have to provide some form of balance, and that balance has to come in the form of additional pressure and sanctions.
Professor Quandt, you care to comment on that?
I think what Ali is saying is that if these pressures were to work, and I think there's some evidence that Israelis do take seriously these kind of movements to mobilize opinion against the occupation, it might have some effect on the internal balances of Israeli politics. That's where it might have some change. Israelis would say, you know, we're paying a price for the continued occupation, and maybe we should have leaders who are more genuinely interested in finding a political solution. And that would take a long time, but it then gets you back to the point of, in those circumstances, could you imagine some kind of a negotiated agreement, or does it just mean that settlement activity stops but the occupation continues? I think the goal should be actually more ambitious than just, you know, slowly shifting public opinion so that Israelis realize they're paying a price in, you know, the world's esteem for Israel as the occupation goes on. It should be to end the occupation, and to end it as soon as possible, because year by year it's becoming more and more difficult to imagine how you disentangle Israelis from the West Bank. So I still think that, you know, one shouldn't give up on the idea that a negotiated agreement is to end the occupation and give Palestinians the chance to govern themselves is a worthy goal. And it doesn't conflict with the kinds of more civil society developments that Ali's talking about, BDS and pressures and public appeals to public opinion and so forth. The alternative to a diplomatic solution, I think, is just more of what we've seen for the past 20 years. The situation will continue to evolve as it has. Israel will continue to build more settlements, and we will get to the point where everybody simply says it can't be solved, or it's beyond resolution. It's either going to be eventually not resolved but settled as a result of sheer power or sheer demography. and it'll be played out over a very long time. The Palestine-Israel conflict will be relegated to a category that looks like the Cyprus conflict, the Kashmir conflict. Everybody knows these are problematic situations that have been with us for a long time. They don't easily yield to diplomacy, but nobody thinks that they need a lot of urgent attention on any given day. I mean, that's the risk. The Palestinians, by contrast to, say, the Kashmiris and the Cypriots, at least have the attention of many, many people in the world who still think this is a flashpoint that ought to be somehow diffused. And what I fear is that when this current effort fails, which it very likely will, people say, okay, we tried, that's it, and now this belongs in that category of, we tried, too bad, it now has to just be managed rather than solved. And a managed conflict with this kind of power imbalance means that Israel's occupation goes on, and the depredations to Palestinian well-being in the West Bank goes on, and the Palestinians living in exile remain in exile. And I think it's a very grim prospect. That's why I don't readily give up on the idea of a political solution.
How much a failure of the peace process and this managed conflict, how much will that influence stability in the Middle East and the world as a whole? Assuming that the Palestinians are not going to lay dead and say, okay, there's managed conflicts, let's live with it.
Well, there are plenty of sources of instability in the Middle East today. We know that. But this has always been one. I mean, I think the Palestine issue has played an outsized role in Arab and Muslim political imaginations as a particular grievance. It's not the only one. It's not as if this issue were to go away, the Middle East would all of a sudden become an oasis of stability and peace. But this has a role. I mean, you see in almost every Arab public, particularly those who are in the immediate vicinity, a susceptibility to the appeal to conscience that Palestinians can make. They have a particular grievance that the Arab world should be sensitive to, should have supported, and so forth. So, you know, I was in Cairo shortly after the so-called Arab Spring uprisings, and there were moments when the Palestine issue was out in the streets again. People were, you know, demonstrating in favor of the Palestinians, or demonstrating, and that was not because, you know, the new government in Egypt was mobilizing people. It was because people were finding their voice. So it's there, it's in Egypt, it's in Jordan, it's in Palestine, it's in many parts of the Arab world. And it does provide a kind of issue around which more radical political movements can mobilize. And of course, we all know about outbidding and who's the most ardent supporter and so forth. So yes, it is an issue. It's not going to go away. It's going to become, I mean, when Abu Mazen and his crowd fail, people are going to say, look, we tried moderation. We tried the most moderate Palestinian approach to this conflict that's ever been pursued, and they failed. What do we think is going to come next? Even more moderate? Probably not. So, you know, that's what's at stake at this moment, is which direction are Arab politics, Palestinian politics going to go over the next several years? And I think we're in a situation where the odds are very much against the more moderate voices who say, let's try to find a diplomatic, negotiated solution. I think it probably is the case that this is going to fail, but I don't think we should be complacent about what comes next.
Ali, do you care to say anything?
Well, I'm glad that Bill mentioned the regional context, because in fact I think, I mean, that may be a bigger issue than we can discuss in this session. But it is very hard to see things moving towards a better outcome in the current regional context. And in fact, of course, in the beginning of the Egyptian uprising, there was popular mobilization for Palestine. There was always strong solidarity, and is, among Egyptians for Palestine. But what's also unmistakable, and this isn't only in Egypt, is the anti-Palestinian trend of the elites. I mean, in Egypt in particular, And it's crucial, of course, now. I mean, this isn't just a theoretical thing. In Gaza, children are walking to school in knee-deep in sewage right now. This is happening now as we speak because the Egyptian-Israeli siege is tighter than ever. And the fuel for the electricity plant, you know, there's now only a few hours of electricity per day. The sewage pumps have stopped working, and many neighborhoods in Gaza are flooded in sewage, and children are walking to school in sewage. This is the consequence of the sewer-like politics of the region right now, where the Egyptians and the Israelis, with the support of other regimes, are tightening the siege of Gaza. And this is in a broad context of actually incitement against Palestinians, blaming Palestinians for all the problems in Egypt, the propagation of lies that Hamas is sending thousands of fighters and Grad missiles to the Muslim Brotherhood. All of this has been in the Egyptian regime media, both the private and the state media that's subservient to the regime. And this is a pattern that we saw also in Iraq following the US invasion, when Palestinians were scapegoated and targeted. And it's happening to an extent in Syria as well, where Palestinians are being Palestinians who are helpless and powerless are being demanded to take sides in a brutal conflict in which they can have no, in which there will be no outcome except their destruction. So the regional context is very troubling. And I think it's important, I hope in the rest of the day, I simply put that out there now, but hopefully to come back to those issues as well.
Professor Quandt, let's say the peace process fails, and it looks like it will, and the U.S. has invested some energy and resources in getting a solution. The balance of power is not going to change anytime in the near future, even with BDS and all that. Is there a chance that the United States would come up with a proposal of its own and try to impose it? And if so, how do you imagine such a proposal to look like?
I can't imagine that Secretary Kerry has invested as much time and energy as he has, unless he has in the back of his mind that at some point in the near future the United States will put forward some kind of bridging proposals. If he doesn't have that in the back of his mind, I don't know what he's doing, because he must know that the parties on their own are just going to keep on doing what they've been doing, or the negotiations will just come to an end. So I think the next logical step for the United States, if it is at all serious, will be to at least go on the record saying, you know, we've been struggling with this issue for a long time. We've come to a conclusion that if there is going to be a negotiated agreement, it's going to have to be within the following guidelines, which we would be willing to support enthusiastically. And if the parties aren't willing to do that, we're simply not able to come up with any other ideas and let somebody else try. What would those proposals look like? I would say Clinton parameters plus. Clinton parameters weren't great. They were awkwardly formulated. They were presented very late in the day. But on certain substantive issues, you could work to improve each of them in ways that I think would give you an outline of, I know we probably disagree on whether a two-state solution is a reasonable thing to still be talking about. But if you do think it's still worth talking about, Clinton proposals plus would describe what that two-state option would look like. Basically, you know, its borders, where Jerusalem fits in, refugee rights, security, the 4 or 5 crucial issues, and you would spell that out in a more convincing way than Clinton did and say that's what we could support and we think our European allies would support, and we actually think it's quite compatible with the Arab Peace Initiative that was put forward in the 2002, 2003, whenever it was. And so there's a kind of international consensus on these broad principles, and we are going to use whatever influence we have with the parties to get them to respond constructively to this proposal. Now, what you used another term, would we try to impose it? I don't think we can literally impose. On the other hand, we're not without influence in the world if we choose to use it. Most of the time, my big complaint about the so-called peace process, which incidentally is a term I dislike despite the fact that I used it as a title for my book, is that it's never been put to a serious test. Could a negotiation based on between Israelis and Palestinians, based on this two-state principle, be brought to a point where each side has to contemplate the hard decisions that would be necessary to make a two-state solution work? We came maybe a little bit close in the early, let's say, 1994, 1995, just before Rabin's assassination. Yossi Beilin and Abu Mazen were sketching an outline of what a two-state solution would look like, which doesn't look too bad, although it's a pretty thin outline, but it was there. And then briefly at the end of the Clinton administration, there was another flurry of activity, and that's pretty much been it. So I would say we've never really put the proposition to the test. Is this doable? We know it would be difficult. We know that it's going to have to deal with issues like borders, like settlements, like Jerusalem, like refugee rights. Nothing new in all of that. People have been talking about it endlessly. There's a document that, for anybody who's interested in it, shows what Israelis and Palestinians who weren't in official positions could make out of it, so-called Geneva Initiative, which I think, as a non-Palestinian, non-Israeli reading through it, if the parties could agree to that, the world should enthusiastically support it. So it's not as if this is unknown territory. There are plenty of benchmarks that you can point to. Now, some people don't like it because they don't think it gives justice to one side or the other, or that it's too painful to make these compromises, but the two-state model is not all that difficult to describe if it's going to be the model that is worked on. The other thing I would say is that at the end of the day, if the Israelis or the Palestinians don't like it, they have the right to reject it. I would think the negotiators ought to be in the frame of mind, said, we're going to give this our best shot. This is the last chance we have. And at the end of the day, we'll go to our respective publics and say, this is what we could produce through diplomacy. If you like it, give us a yes. And if you don't, say no, and we'll go back. We'll quit. We'll let somebody else try. I think that's the only fair way to proceed. And that gives Palestinians the right to say yes or no on a concrete proposition that offers the chance of ending the occupation in most of the West Bank and giving them some partial justice, not perfect justice, but some partial justice. And if they reject it, I think they have the right to reject it. But I think it ought to be put concretely to both parties and say, this is the last chance you're going to have with our support to have a negotiated solution.
Ali?
I think it's really far beyond any of that. And the basic problem is that, everything that you said, Bill, is very reasonable. And I think the issue, though, is that it contains an assumption that, both sides, and I don't like the term both sides because it implies an equality that is totally non-existent.
I started by saying that.
No, and I accept that, but I just even don't like to use the word both sides myself, even though I am. But it contains an assumption that both sides are looking for such an outcome. And the Abbas authority, which has no legitimacy whatsoever politically or morally or legally, would accept far less than the 2000 Camp David proposal. If they were offered it, they would eagerly grab at a few shreds of the West Bank and call it a state, if the Israelis would offer it to them. I mean, the irony is now that Palestinians are in the position where, as Netanyahu says, I'm going to adopt Netanyahu's phrase with regard to Iran, he says, no deal is better than a bad deal. And I say, for the Palestinians, no deal with Israel is better than a bad deal, because a bad deal will irrevocably cancel Palestinian rights. And now the only thing protecting Palestinians from a bad deal is Israel's intransigence, Israel's refusal to accept. I mean, Abbas is going every day offering Palestinian rights on a plate, and Netanyahu is saying that's not enough. So this is a strange irony. But the important point in this sense is that the Israelis are not looking for a deal along the 1967 lines or anything close to the 1967 lines. Remember then when Obama dared to squeak the word 1967 a year or two ago, the uproar. How dare you say 1967 lines? And he had to withdraw it. Who can imagine that this timid and cowardly administration would ever challenge Israel and say, you have to do this, that, or the other? And of course now the Clinton parameters and all of that are so far from the reality. The political reality, the geopolitical reality, and the reality on the ground. Israel isn't interested in borders. Israel is interested in expansion and interested in erasing borders and interested in making the life of Palestinians so difficult that they will leave. This is what Naftali Bennett, the rising star of Israeli politics, who's in Washington now, is aiming for. And I want to mention another factor, because I see a trend where people are noticing correctly tensions between the United States and Israel over the subject of Iran. And those tensions are real. And there is, between the US political military establishment on the one hand and Israel on the other, a real clash over Iran. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that this will rebound to the benefit of Palestinians. On the contrary, it's very dangerous for Palestinians, because the dynamics that I see taking place are that, you know, the United States is telling Israel, basically, you know, the question of Iran is for us. It's for the big boys. And you don't mess around and you don't tell us what to do, and there's some pushback. But the compensation for Israel and for its fanatical lobby in the United States is you can do whatever you like in the West Bank. We're not going to, you know. So basically, the United States is compensating Israel over Iran by being even more lenient as Israel continues to steal Palestinian land. So this dynamic means that, you know, the Israelis aren't they're interested in expansion. And so the way Israel is politically, I think one of the best descriptions of present-day Israel is Max Blumenthal's book, Goliath, which just came out. And, you know, when you read that book, you see that this is not an Israel that is interested in borders and the two-state solution. It is a fanatically ultra-nationalist, settler colonial mentality that sees Palestinians not as potential neighbors, not as potential peace partners, but as an obstacle to the fulfillment of this Zionist vision. And it's only if we have that understanding, that diagnosis, and I you know, use that term, a diagnosis, that we can then proceed to discuss what might work as a treatment.
Very well said. So you gentlemen very eloquently described many reasons, real reasons, why this peace process doesn't have a very good chance of creating two states. And realizing that many people are calling for a different solution, which is one state for both people. How do you envision an idea like that would be managed diplomatically and in real life? What would the area look like if the Palestinians change their direction and say, we want to live on an equal basis, we don't care about borders, we are human beings, we deserve to be treated on an equal basis with people in this part of the world? How would that work out? How would it be received? And does it have a chance of success? Bill,
Ali's
that's
written the
alluded.
book about it, so I think he ought to start.
Okay. Ali,
Well,
we have 5 minutes. I hate to say that.
Okay.
We got to give time for the audience to ask their
Great.
burning questions.
Well, the short, I'll take this second to plug that I have a book coming out in a few months, hopefully, which addresses some of these questions directly. Because since, the discussion about a single state, and some people say we shouldn't talk about one state or two states, and there's some merit to the question should be discussed in its proper context. But in the long run, this is a question that's going to keep coming back. What does an ultimate political outcome look like? And I think the framework we have to see it in is one of stripping Israel of its settler colonial nature and the term that has been used, decolonizing and indigenizing all the people in the country who wish to live there as equals. And we know that the issue was never the presence of Jews in Palestine. This is one of the falsehoods that I think is propagated is that there is some inherent problem with Jewish people being in Palestine. This was never the case historically. The issue was a ultra-nationalist Zionist movement that sought to displace the indigenous people. So if we understand that, it's possible to imagine a future in which the people there live in a different political framework and coexist. And I think you have to see it in a broader regional context as well. The possibility, one of the questions I try to answer in the new book, people say always, well, okay, you can dream of this and it's pie in the sky, but with all the hatred, with all the history, is it possible? I believe that it still is possible. I do think that there is that we can look forward to such a future, and that's the challenge that I try to tackle head on in the next book.
Bill?
I don't have any problem with the vision. I think, as a secular person myself who doesn't like states that are built around narrow definitions of ethnicity or sectarian identity, I think it'd be great if Palestinians and Israelis could bring themselves to live equally in a single state. I just don't see it happening in any obvious way. If you could get the next generation of Israelis to conceive of themselves quite differently, you could also get them to accept a two-state solution, perhaps as the way station to a more cooperative and eventually federated and even confederated relationship between the two peoples in Palestine. But how you begin to get that enormous ideological change that it would take for Israelis to give up the idea of a predominantly Jewish state, which is what Zionism was all about.
Right.
And I don't see it happening. There's a minuscule percentage of Israelis today who would agree with Ali. There are probably more Palestinians, but at least as far as I can see, by anything like contemporary public opinion polling, if it means anything, there are many more people who would say separation and two states is a more realistic, near-term solution than a one-state solution, even if the one state appeals to some people on idealistic grounds. So all I would say is if you can imagine getting to Ali's outcome, you can also get to a two-state outcome.
The short answer, I tackle that question absolutely head-on because not because it is the most reasonable and most obvious response to what I'm saying, but nobody or almost no Israelis support this. So how could you think about this? I have the answer, but I'm going to keep you in suspense. But the thing I want to say is that the difference between this idea of a way station of two states is that the ultimate outcome of decolonization, of equality, of restitution, of a single polity, is that it really doesn't require anyone to give up any legitimate rights. Whereas the idea of repartition, of a Palestinian state, even in the most generous form one can imagine, does irrevocable violence to Palestinian rights. And so that's the difference, when you talk about decolonization and indigenizing the settler population and making everyone whole who has lost, that ultimately is a more ethical outcome as well. And that's why I think if we're dealing with two equally difficult possibilities, there's a moral imperative to choose the one that is the most ethical. And that's why I think that the debate has shifted, and it will continue to move in that direction. Not that I'm not suggesting, I want to be clear, that those who have advocated for two states have done so because they're unethical or because they're immoral or because they weren't sincere. I think it came from a very sincere place of saying, this is the best. This is the way we can come to the least harm and bring some. I absolutely accept that. But I feel that because that has failed and because there's no possibility of it, we have to also adjust to the reality that exists now on the ground.
Very well said. I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Please make pointed questions, not extensive comments, and I will try to be fair to to everybody on both sides. And I want to save a few minutes at the end for our panelists to give closing remarks. Yes, sir, you opened your hand first.
Thank you very much. My question concerns.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Benjamin Tu, a retired diplomat.
Right, go ahead.
My question concerns the comments of the speakers on the relative power of the two sides on one hand, and also the role of civil society efforts and international law on the other. It seems to me that the Palestinians are actually increasing in power through their ability, their support from in many countries, including wealthy Arab countries and broader internationally, and through through civil society efforts. Now, on international law, which has not been really addressed, it seems to me ironic that the United States is saying that the conflict has to be resolved through negotiations and not through organs such as the United Nations, which was the basis on which Israel was established. So I wonder if you can comment on these observations.
Just briefly, I'm not sure that if Palestinian power is increasing, it should show up in terms of changing realities on the ground. That hasn't yet happened. Maybe it will, but it hasn't yet. Secondly, I think that there is at least some interest in looking at the United Nations today as a forum where something could be done, but I don't think it has great prospects. But you have a fairly strong consensus now among the members of the Security Council. You could imagine, for example, a new Security Council resolution, a kind of post-242 that spells out the basic principles on which an Israeli-Palestinian peaceful future should be built. I'm not sure it would be exactly the one that Ali would like, but I think it would be one in which certain fundamental principles of equity and fairness could be embodied. Now, what would happen with that resolution, any more than whatever happened to 242, but sometimes it's worthwhile putting down a marker that the international community would support certain things. You could even try to delegitimize further settlement activity with that resolution. You could encourage states not to support by their actions activities of Israel in the occupied territories. It's not going to dramatically change things overnight, but I don't think it's a total waste of time either, because the UN is less subject to kind of an automatic veto by one side or the other when issues go to the Security Council now. As we've seen on issues like Iran and Syria, there is a potential working framework, but I wouldn't get my hopes up too high.
Dr. Ramadan?
I have a question to Mr. Ali Abu Nimah. My question is, since the negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis is unidirectional gain on the Israeli side and tremendous loss on the Palestinian side, why the Palestinian Authority insisting on continuing the education, playing this losing game? It doesn't make sense to me.
Ali?
That's a very good question, Doctor. Thank you. And it's a question that makes no sense. You're right. If you think that the object and goal of the Palestinian Authority is to achieve an outcome and a state and to bring some justice to the Palestinian people, of course it doesn't make sense. But that's not the goal. And this is, as I said, I don't even like to use the term leadership because, I mean, they're not connected to anyone. They living in the Ramallah Green Zone, surrounded by security forces armed and trained by the United States, armed only with the permission of Israel, collaborating on a daily basis with the occupation against Palestinians, against resistance, against even peaceful protest. And working on a business level, this is something we don't talk about much, completely integrated into the Israeli economic elite. So these, big conglomerates are also, the Palestinian conglomerates are also doing very well economically and financially from this situation. So the status quo in the Ramallah Green Zone is not that bad. But the problem is it's not sustainable everywhere else. And so they have to continue the charade of negotiations. I mean, first they said, no, we won't negotiate. And then they were told, basically, you have to, or, the Israelis cut off the money, the Congress will stop the aid, and so on. Last week, when Saeb Araqat and his crew threatened to resign for the 100th time, by the way, resigning for them doesn't mean you stop receiving your salary. You resign while receiving your salary. So after they resigned the 100th time, or they threatened to, and then they withdrew it and they denied it. I mean, I don't know what the latest word is on whether Saeb Araqat is resigning or not. But Kerry went to Ramallah and they promised another 75 million in American funds to keep paying the salaries and to keep the machine functioning. I mean, the Palestinian Authority functions as, we've all said it before, as a subcontractor for the occupation and so on, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's also a system for redistributing, for distributing salaries and so on to hundreds of thousands of people and to families. So they're really going from one day to the next to survive and to keep this machine moving. And if Kerry tells them come and talk, they come and talk. What we do tomorrow, we'll worry about tomorrow. And that's as much as I'll say about it now, but that's the only way you can begin to make sense of it.
But the main issue is lost.
If we leave it in their hands, yes. Yes.
Yusuf, mic here, please. Then here, right there, the lady, and then we'll go to the left side.
Thank you. My name is Rabbi David Feldman at Ture Karta International. My question to Ali. First of all, I certainly agree to what you said in regard to the rights of the Palestinians that are ignored when we deal with the two-state solution. As Jewish people, we say that according to Judaism, this is forbidden to create this state of Israel, and certainly taking the rights of the Palestinians is wrong, and this is what our communities spoke about already for 60-odd years. But my question is, what do you answer to the question, practical terms, politically speaking, that in order to gain something, the Palestinians should give up at least some of their rights? Well, I don't agree with giving up, but technically speaking, what's the answer to that?
No, we abuse in the discussion of the so-called peace process, we talk about compromise. And compromise is deemed a good thing. And if you don't compromise, if you're not willing to compromise, if you're not willing to be moderate, then you're an extremist and you're a rejectionist and you don't want peace. And this discourse has been used to bully Palestinians for decades. To do what? To give up fundamental human rights that nobody else has ever been asked to give up in the modern era. So so when you say that if Palestinians have to recognize Israel as a so-called Jewish state, it means that they have to accept that they are less human, that a Palestinian born in Palestine, a Palestinian born in Safad, is less human than somebody from New Jersey or from Canada who has no prior connection to the country who can go and live in Safad. I mentioned Safad for two reasons. One, because it's the hometown, the birthplace of Mahmoud Abbas, who announced publicly that he renounces his right to return to Safad. And the other reason is because Safad was always a center of Jewish learning long before there was Zionism. So, when we talk about compromise, we compromise on practicalities, on modalities for implementing something. You give and you take. But you don't compromise on your fundamental human rights. And Palestinians have been asked to give up fundamental human rights that in a present context, remember in Bosnia, we're always told rights of refugees and right of return. If you ask for the right of return, you're an extremist and you want to destroy Israel, and there's no support for it. This is the mantra Palestinians are always told. Am I correct? Well, how about Bosnia? There was a war 20 years ago, a horrifying war in Bosnia with neighbor against neighbor, a vicious civil war, like nothing that had been seen in Europe since World War II. Bosnia is a country of 3 million people. Very quietly, over the past 20 years, more than 500,000 refugees, in fact, in the first 10 years after the war, now the number must be higher, returned to their original homes. The right of return was implemented. It didn't matter if they were from a minority in an area that was now dominated by a hostile majority. Their rights were respected. Their property was restituted. And those states or those sub-states that were told, you want to have a Serb majority or a Muslim majority or a Croat majority, tough luck. The rights of refugees supersede your desire for ethnic supremacy. And it was the so-called international community that helped the refugees to return in Bosnia. Why are only Palestinians told that you must respect Israel's right to be racist against you? So let's be clear. When we say compromise and moderation, it is the Palestinians who've offered far-reaching compromises, who in the context of the so-called peace process, who said, we would abandon 78% of historic Palestine and accept a state in 22%. And the answer of Israel was, sorry, 22%, that's much too much for you.
Mike, right here, please.
Jerome Siegel, University of Maryland. My question is for Bill Quandt. Bill, you didn't say this, but I take it as just part of the way you think about this, that you would agree that who is in power in Israel, that is, who is the prime minister, makes a considerable difference, and that if I was talking about the probability of a negotiated settlement, it would vary enormously depending on who that prime minister was. And without arguing for that, I guess my question is to link that to American diplomacy. The U.S. can't directly interfere with Israeli elections and so forth, but an American diplomatic initiative could potentially insert forces into the Israeli body politic that could either hopefully bring about deep transformation in the ruling coalition or break up that coalition, deep transformations in what Netanyahu is prepared to accept, or alternatively, over time, contribute to a change in government. And you were talking before about Kerry putting on the table sort of a Clinton plus, which is largely in a form of parameters and about how Israelis and Palestinians have an opportunity to say yes or no. But the experience that we had with the Clinton parameters wasn't that we got clear yeses and nos. We got yeses with reservations and so on. And it was very ambiguous, and it remained ambiguous whether or not anybody ever accepted that, when they accepted it, what it meant for them to accept it, and so on. But the alternative that hasn't been tried isn't really a new 242. It's something much closer to a new 181, whether it was to be coming out of the UN or more ideally coming out of the United States. And the difference is really parameters versus a detailed treaty agreement, for instance, that has a map that's very finely drawn that would provide for what the two states and so on. Now, the question I would think in terms of producing forces that would endure and change the ball game, at least over time, inside of Israel, would be two things. One would be to have such a detailed plan on the table that didn't actually require further negotiations, but basically required we accept it or we don't accept it, and then, of course, between the two states, they could deal with details. So that would be one thing, to get that on the table. And the other would be able to get a clear, straightforward, we accept it from the Palestinian side and from the Arab states as saying it satisfied the API. And I guess my question to you is not, well, I guess the first question is really, do you believe that getting to that point where we had something that was a map that was detailed and had specific solutions for refugees, Jerusalem, and so on, that didn't require further negotiations, and that the Palestinians and the Arab states said yes to, would be something that would be a game changer in terms of the politics? And secondly, if you think that at least as a desirable outcome, maybe not as much of a game changer as I might think, how can we get to that?
It's a big question for the remaining minute or two that we have. I guess my instinct is to say that we're probably not going to get to that kind of a bridging formulation if we get to any at all. But hypothetically, were we to get to something that looked as if many Palestinians could accept it, many Arabs could accept it, and it was the Israeli side that was hesitating, it would set off some kind of debate in Israel, and it might bring about some political change there. The only time I can think of when the United States taking a fairly firm stand with Israel had an effect on Israeli domestic politics in a direction of bringing to the fore more reasonable voices was in 1992 when Shamir was unable to win election, partly because the United States came down hard on him over settlements and refused to give $10 billion in loan guarantees. And he was unable to go to his electorate and say, you know, I'm getting all this money and we can do the settlements. He was, in a sense, having to say, we'll give up the money in order to continue the settlement project. And he lost the election to Yitzhak Rabin, who, okay, maybe Rabin wasn't as big a change, but at least he was a change in the direction of a more reasonable Israeli stance on negotiating with the Palestinians. So I think the United States can sometimes influence Israeli politics, but I must say the collapse of anything like an Israeli peace camp makes that a very dim prospect in the near future.
Right there, please. The lady.
Andrea Farsak, retired U.S. diplomat. A couple of things that could possibly shake things loose from either side. One of them, Naftali Bennett proposing, and increasingly the Israeli right wing on a roll, trying to annex Area C, which is, I think, what this government in Israel is moving towards now. What might be the repercussions of that in the international community? Another might be the increasing tensions over the Temple Mount that have been growing lately. If that exploded, what might be the repercussions of that? And the third, something the Palestinians might do in absolute frustration and desperation, possibly, is say, we don't want a two-state solution anymore. We want one man, one vote in Israel. What would be the repercussions of that, both in the international community and in the United States, where I think that would have a powerful effect? Thank you.
Ali, have it, and Bill after that.
Thank you. Those are some very good questions. I think the issue of Naftali Bennett, and of course, for those who aren't familiar with the name, he is the head of the forget the name, Jewish Home Party, who sort of surged in the last election from nowhere and has a very clear platform of annexation of the West Bank and reducing the Palestinians there to basically permanent residence without any civil rights. And that's his platform, and that there will never be a Palestinian state. And I think it's a mistake to underestimate how mainstream his views are. When you look at the polling from Israel, including from the Israel Democracy Institute, you find that Naftali Bennett's ideas are increasingly mainstream values. And the idea that there is some peace camp that, you know, sees the urgency of withdrawing from the West Bank in order to preserve Israel as a so-called Jewish and democratic state really doesn't match with what's actually happening in Israel. Israelis are very comfortable with maintaining control of the West Bank long-term indefinitely, expanding settlements. There's no popular movement against this. I mean, there's a few small groups here and there, but you know, there is no. Why aren't there hundreds of thousands of Israelis in Tel Aviv demanding an end to the occupation? Where is this mythical Israeli peace camp? Doesn't exist. So, so annexation is mainstream, and it's happened in practice. What Naftali Bennett proposes is not really any change in the status quo. It's simply being open about it. It's coming out of the closet and saying, we own this, we're annexing it, and that's it. You like it or you don't like it. And the same with Gaza. So when he talks about the West Bank and Gaza, he says there will be no safe passage. Gaza will be totally disconnected. It will be the problem of Egypt. And, but that's the status quo currently. It's simply about naming it being out and proud. That's what Naftali Bennett wants Israel to be, out and proud as annexers and apartheid rulers. And sadly, that's fine. I mean, today John McCain tweeted a photo of himself with Naftali Bennett, and he's doing the rounds, and it won't be long before we see him kissing and hugging European leaders as well, as Avigdor Lieberman previously was laundered and normalized by you know, the so-called international community. So unless there is an international grassroots civil society response that says no, that begins to treat this racist, annexationist, settler colonial regime as the pariah that it is, it will be normalized. So it's very important that we continue to push for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and not to expect that, with all due respect to diplomats, and my father was a diplomat, that, you know, diplomats are suddenly going to start doing the right thing. Unless there is a movement, it's not going to happen.
And what about Jerusalem and one man, one vote?
What's happening in Jerusalem, you know, with the increasing aggression of the settlers towards Al-Aqsa, and their goal is initially, you know, these are groups that are open about their desire to see the destruction of Al-Aqsa and the building of a third temple. They're open about that. But their interim goal is to partition Al-Aqsa the way the Ibrahimi Mosque was partitioned in Hebron. And their tactics have been the same tactics Zionist settler colonialism has used for a century, which is every day to push just a little bit further. So no aggression is considered a game changer. You gain what they used to say, dunam by dunam, goat by goat. And that's the practice now with Al-Aqsa. Each week, each Friday to push just a little bit further. And the day will come when the settlers arrive in Al-Aqsa and they never leave. And all of a sudden everyone will say, what happened? But I think it's important as this is symbolically, religiously, to put what's happening at Al-Aqsa in the context of the ongoing land grab in Palestine. Because, you know, what's happening in Al-Aqsa is the same as what's happening in the Naqab with the Power Plan and the open intention of Israel to ethnically cleanse another 40,000 Bedouins in the Naqab and to Judaize their land. It's all of a piece with what's happening in the West Bank, what's happening in the Galilee. So it's important to see Israel as a settler colonial regime. I think that, you know, if Palestinians move towards that understanding of Israel as a settler colonial regime that has no borders within Palestine, then you move towards a framework of decolonization in which an eventual outcome is a one-person, one-vote system. I don't think you can just talk about voting rights isolated from understanding of how do you stop and how do you combat settler colonialism. But I do think that's the direction that's moving. But of course, the threat from the PA, from the Palestinian Authority, if you don't give us a state, then we'll ask for one state. On that superficial level, that's like Saeb Arafat's resignations.
Right. I think the next question comes from the gentleman right there. He asked.
Thank you, Usama Makdisi from Rice University. I have a question for Bill Quandt, and I'd like you, Bill, if you could, to respond to Ali's point when he said that the U.S. is, what was the word you used, Ali? It's not an honest broker. It's
combatant.
It's a combatant. And I'm wondering, Bill, given your experience, you know, everything I heard you say today is basically the paradigm that's been brought up over and over again, two parties, two solution, the U.S. external force. You know, I mean, presumably that this paradigm has failed insofar as a peace or peaceful solution is simply not there. So I'm wondering how you actually address Ali's point about the U.S. being totally complicit, neutralizing the Palestinian question rather than in any way, shape, or form solving it. And do you take that seriously as a criticism? In other words, the U.S. as a party, not simply as an external factor.
Yes, of course I take seriously. I mean, what he's saying is in fundamental ways true. Now, my response to it is that the United States, when it became a mediator between Egypt and Israel, which was after the 1973 war, did so with the strong encouragement of the Egyptians, who had just fought a war against Israel, during which the United States had sent arms to Israel. So you couldn't have a more graphic moment when the United States was actively supporting the Israelis militarily, and within weeks of that war, the Egyptians were saying, we want you Americans to come and help mediate an agreement, which we did. And it got them their territory back. Not because we were fair and balanced and even-handed, but because we had enough clout with the Israelis so that when we saw that our national interests meant that Egypt was a country with whom we could eventually develop our own strong strategic relationship, we were prepared to put some money on the table and some effort into persuading the Israelis to give up Egyptian territory. There were many people in the world who were more, quote, even-handed than the Americans in late 1973. The Swiss, the Swedish, the Norwegians, and everybody else. Interesting that Sadat didn't go to them and ask for them to be the mediators. He went to the Americans because the Americans potentially could persuade the Israelis to make concessions in a way that no other country in the world can. Now, I'm not sure whether the analog works today with the Palestinians, because our political system is so unable to imagine putting pressure on the Israelis. But it is striking that with all of the one-sidedness of American policy, I still don't hear too many voices among Palestinians, with perhaps the exception of Ali and people like him, saying the Americans should just get out of the business entirely. Just leave us alone. Don't do anything. My sense is that it still matters that Kerry, in his bumbling way, gets up there and says, settlements are illegitimate. I don't quite know how that differs from illegal, but it would be nice to hear him actually say they're illegal. Not that they will immediately stop building settlements, but it does help to shape the normative framework, to have the most powerful country in the world to say what you're doing is actually illegitimate. The next step would, of course, be to say, and there are consequences if you continue to do this. That's what's been missing. It's not that the United States couldn't play a more influential role, but it constantly runs up against the limits set by its own politics. And that's a problem largely in Congress and in selected parts of American public opinion. It's not true in the American public at large. And that's why I think Ali's right that civil society can play a role. If some of the scenarios that you mentioned take place, annexation of Area C and so forth, it's not going to shake the fundamental support that Congress gives to Israel, not in the near term. But I can tell you from having been teaching for the last 20 years, it has an effect on the younger generation. They are no longer enthralled with this image of, little Israel out there needing support. They see Israel as a bully, as a country that doesn't pay any attention to equity, international law, and steps like this will alienate not just ordinary Americans, but Jewish Americans who actually care about Israel. Right now you see a drop-off, significant drop-off of pro-Israeli sentiment among university students. There are some enthusiasts, but in place after place on university campuses, you find many more people of Jewish heritage willing to stand up and say Palestinians actually do have rights. So maybe in the long term that translates into politics, but it's a very, very slow process. The political establishment that we have today is quite frankly very, very one-sided, much more so than it was 20 years ago.
We have time for 2 more questions before the coffee break if we want to stay on time. Dr. Faiz, your hand is tired being up all this time.
Well, I think that the solution to this problem is why the Israelis are having it so easy in Palestine now. They have never had a better time than these days. The answer came from the Chief of Intelligence Services in a lecture to his partners of the other services, telling them that Abbas is working for us 100%. And he works for Israel anything we ask him for, regardless what he says outside. And he says that the group, the cabinet that works with him, they work for us as well. Not only this is documented. It is not something from my pocket. It is well documented, and I have a copy of that. Not only this, some of his cabinets go to the Arab countries and recruit spies and agents for us. So, my friends, the question here is, I was in South Africa 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, and I met with some people. We came to the conclusion that they killed or they got rid of their groups among them who used to say, well, we are with Mandela and the others, because they found they were collaborating with the white Africans. Therefore, my question to you both, please answer. Don't you think that the first step to liberate Palestine, or at least to have peace in Palestine, is to get rid of this collaborating agency called the Palestinian Authority? We as humans here, I can see many people here. If the ambassador, he called himself ambassador, he's not ambassador, he's nothing. Make a party. Half of these people here, half of them, and I know many of them, will be there. And instead of saying, no, you are collaborator, you are a traitor, we should not give you, all of them. And some of them make a small party, they invited him thinking that he is important. You have to tell them they are not important, they are traitors. This is the solution. Ali and the other friend, please, don't you think the first step is to get rid of these people?
Go ahead, Ali. Short. Please make it short, Ali.
The short answer is, of course, absolutely. Of course, the Palestine, as we've said, as I've said many times, that this is an illegitimate authority. It is financed and supported by the United States very openly with Israel. Remember the article by Jody Redorin in the New York Times from a year or so ago when she accompanied a delegation from Meretz to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, and she quoted him saying, I told the Israelis, please, 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 give me more guns, give me more weapons so that I can, continue to control the Palestinian population on your behalf. And as he keeps promising, no intifada, no uprising, and so on. The bigger question, because I think people understand this. I mean, you're right in a sense, is we can only give it legitimacy. I mean, even resistance groups talk about, Sayyid al-Ra'is. If you say Sayyid al-Ra'is, you're granting legitimacy to something that has no legitimacy. I want to say one thing, because the Palestine papers, when they came out, and I had a chance to look at them before they were published in depth, and I want to encourage the scholars here to delve into those papers because there's so much more in them. For me, it was the final straw when I saw the transcripts of the meetings between Saab Araqat and Abu Ala and Abu Mazen and others, when they're telling the Israelis, not just once, repeatedly, the siege on Gaza isn't tight enough. Why aren't you doing more to stop Palestinians, to stop commerce in and out of Gaza? When they're telling the Israelis, don't release prisoners, don't do a deal to release Gilad Shalit because it will embarrass us and it will help the other side. When you saw the meetings after the election, there was a secret called the Quadripartite Committee that used to meet. The Israeli general, Etan I forget the name, but one of the generals, Dahlan and the others, and the Egyptian intelligence, and they were meeting secretly. And two of the documents, the minutes, are in the Palestine papers. It's called the Quadripartite Committee. Most people don't know about it. They were meeting to conspire against the elected Palestinian Authority. Whether you supported that authority or didn't, it was elected, like the president of Egypt was elected. And if we say elections and democracy, then by goodness you have to respect the result, and you have to let the process work. And in Palestine, they weren't prepared to do that. Now, a final point with the indulgence of Dr. Eid. I can tell you the Palestine papers, and you can go and look at them. But we also don't need to go to secret leaked documents. 3 days ago, Abbas was in Cairo and openly urging the coup regime to continue to smash the tunnels that have been the only lifeline against the siege. And I made it to Gaza, my first visit to Gaza in May, and I saw the tunnels, and I went down the tunnels. And all of the propaganda in the media, and Abbas said it, they're bringing iPads and luxury goods and so on. What we saw coming in through the tunnels was basic goods, gravel, cement. Gaza is still in ruins. People haven't been able to rebuild. The only source of fuel and construction supplies for most people in Gaza, for food that they can afford, is from the tunnels. And Abbas is in Gaza telling Egypt, smash the tunnels. And children in Gaza are walking to school knee-deep in sewage.
Yeah. Our panelists will be with us for the break and for most of the day. I hate to decline any more questions for sake of time, because coffee break is very important for some people, isn't it? Please help me thank the panelists for a great discussion.